It was the sort of May morning that made St. Mary Mead look like a watercolor painting, fresh, delicate, and too pretty to feel real. The roses were opening early, bees were drowsily drifting across the hedgerows, and preparations were underway at the Grand Harwood estate for the long-anticipated wedding of Daphne Harwood to Oliver Fane. The bride's family, having recently returned from colonial business in Singapore, had chosen to host the ceremony at the ancestral home, a sprawling Georgian manor with ivy-covered facades and whispers of old wealth in every hallway. Servants bustled. A white canopy was being raised on the lawn, and the air buzzed with celebratory tension. But behind the trimmed box hedges and silver tea trays, something would soon happen that would stop the wedding cold. At 9:30, as the bridal party prepared upstairs, a sharp cry echoed from the east wing. Sylvia Langley, Daphne's cousin and maid of honor, had vanished from her dressing room. Her gown still lay neatly folded on the bed. The hairdresser, who had stepped out for only 10 minutes, returned to find the door locked from the inside. A call for help brought footmen to break the latch, but the room was empty. No open windows, no secret passages, no signs of a struggle, just a faint trace of her perfume in the air and a bridesmaid's bouquet scattered across the floor like a dropped handkerchief. Miss Marple, who had been invited more out of social courtesy than any connection to the family, had arrived that morning in her best hat and lace gloves. She had hardly sipped her first cup of tea in the conservatory when the news reached her. While the men of the house, red-faced and fumbling, launched a frantic search and the bride dissolved into tears, Miss Marple calmly set her teacup down and requested to see the dressing room. The room itself was as polished and ordinary as could be. Soft mauve walls, a chaise longue, and a wide vanity lined with pearl-handled brushes. The window overlooked a steep drop into rose bushes and was firmly latched from within. No sign of forced entry. A single glove rested beside the bouquet. The wardrobe stood open, its contents untouched. On the dressing table was a small note that read simply, "Don't wait for me." It was unsigned, its tone breezy but odd. Sylvia had no reason to run, nor enemies to flee. She was a well-liked girl, quiet, dependable, no known quarrels, no scandal. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the note. Something about the loop in the D and the sharpness of the T in don't troubled her. It had been hastily written, certainly, but not under duress. Still, she said nothing. Not yet. She walked once more around the room, noting how the dust by the skirting board remained undisturbed and how the wardrobe door bore a faint smear of what looked like powder. It was an unremarkable room, and that made it remarkable indeed. By noon, the police had been summoned from Much Benham. Inspector Creighton, stiff and formal, took immediate charge. His interviews bore little fruit. No one had seen Sylvia leave. No one recalled hearing footsteps. The servants were accounted for, and the house had been locked for the night, with no strangers seen entering or leaving. It was as though the girl had simply dissolved into air. The case quickly earned its whispering, nickname from the housemaids, the bridesmaid who vanished. Guests began to mutter, superstitiously, that the wedding was cursed. And then, almost as suddenly, she returned. At precisely 5 o'clock, just as the constables were preparing to widen the search to the surrounding village, Sylvia Langley walked calmly up the drive, her dress still neatly pressed, her hair pinned, her eyes serene. She claimed she had felt unwell and gone for a walk to clear her head, then gotten turned around in the woods. She seemed confused as to the fuss, and apologized profusely to the bride and groom. But Miss Marple, watching from the terrace, noticed something that no one else did. The shoes. They weren't the same ones Sylvia had been wearing earlier. The heels were lower, scuffed differently, slightly looser in fit, and most importantly, they didn't match her dress. Inspector Creighton gently questioned her again, this time with the quiet tension of a man who sensed something wasn't right, but had no proof. Sylvia repeated her story, calm and unwavering. She had taken a book and wandered. No, she hadn't seen anyone. No, she didn't remember exactly where she had gone. Yes, she understood how it must have looked. But no one could find a scratch on her, no sign of duress, and her alibi, though thin, was hard to disprove. The note was dismissed as a last-minute decision, a failure of courtesy, not a clue. Still, Miss Marple frowned. That night she sat in her room thinking. The door locked from the inside, the window sealed. A note, carefully casual. A return without panic or disarray. Shoes changed. A girl who vanished into thin air and reappeared as if nothing had happened. There was a puzzle here, but not in the disappearance. It was the return that rang false. She had not looked like a girl who had spent the day lost in the woods. She had looked like someone who had prepared to be seen again. And it was then, as Miss Marple turned over the events in her mind, that she remembered something else entirely. Sylvia Langley had vanished once before, years ago, in a scandal hushed by relatives and location. A boarding school in Dorset, a brief disappearance, returned unharmed. The family had claimed a misunderstanding. Miss Marple had read about it in a letter some time ago from a former governess friend. "Twice is too many times," she murmured, aloud. Outside, the wind stirred the rose bushes, and from the corridor the sounds of the resumed wedding could be heard. Champagne corks, laughter, the beginning of a waltz. But the mystery remained suspended in the air, and Miss Marple knew this was only the beginning. The crime, if there was one, had not yet revealed its shape, but it had certainly begun. By the next morning, the wedding had gone ahead in a muted haze of confusion and polite disbelief. Daphne had insisted on proceeding despite the disruption, but her face bore the fragile stiffness of someone who feared what questions might be asked if she postponed. Sylvia, meanwhile, resumed her role. Without comment, her expression unreadable, her movements calm and composed. She stood through the ceremony beside the bride like a figure in a painting, perfectly in place, yet somehow not part of the scene at all. To the average eye, the matter seemed settled, but to Miss Marple, something quietly wrong lingered in every corner of the Harwood estate like a perfume that wouldn't fade. Inspector Creighton remained for the breakfast reception, more to reassure the guests than to investigate further. He asked a few final questions, nodded at a few vague answers, and departed with the reluctant air of a man whose instincts told him something was amiss, but who lacked the thread to pull. Miss Marple, however, did not leave. She had accepted Daphne's offer to remain at the estate for a few days. "You'll be such a comfort to us, dear Jane," the bride had said, still pale under her veil. And Miss Marple had smiled, demure as always, even as her mind turned over each strange detail with quiet precision. That afternoon, while most of the guests took their tea on the lawn, Miss Marple asked if she might view the dressing room again. A young maid named Elsie was tasked with escorting her. Elsie, no older than 17, seemed flustered by the request, twisting her apron nervously as she led Miss Marple down the hall. When they entered, the room looked precisely as it had before, except for the fresh arrangement of lilies placed near the window, a gesture from Daphne, apparently, to dispel the memory of the morning's disturbance. Miss Marple glanced around once, then again more slowly. The faint scuff on the wardrobe door had been cleaned away. The bouquet had been replaced with another, slightly wilted, but it was something in the corner that made her pause. A tiny black pin, no longer than a matchstick, lay near the baseboard. Half hidden in the carpet, she bent to retrieve it. "Has this room been dusted today, Elsie?" "Oh, yes, miss," Elsie replied quickly. "Right after Miss Langley came back, Mrs. Parsons had me tidy it up straight away." Miss Marple turned the pin in her hand. It was unusually sharp and slender, the kind used to secure wigs or theatrical headpieces, hardly the sort of thing one would expect in a bridesmaid's room. "Tell me, dear," Miss Marple said gently, "did anyone else come in here before it was dusted?" Elsie hesitated. "Only Miss Langley. She said she needed to get her handbag." Miss Marple nodded, tucking the pin away in her pocket. She asked no further questions, only smiled faintly and thanked the girl. As they returned down the hall, she spotted Sylvia in the garden, walking with Daphne's younger brother, Henry, a boy of about 21 with a schoolboy's charm and a tendency to laugh too loudly. Sylvia leaned in as he spoke, her expression too animated, too rehearsed. Miss Marple watched them for only a moment before slipping away. That evening, in the drawing room, Miss Marple found herself seated beside Oliver Fane, the groom. He seemed distracted, his smile tight, his fingers drumming against his teacup. She mentioned how lovely the ceremony had been, and how proud he must feel. He nodded vaguely. Then, after a pause, he said, "Sylvia was always a strange girl. Brilliant but secretive. Did Daphne tell you they weren't close as children?" "No," Miss Marple replied mildly, "but families are curious things. Sometimes affection skips sideways rather than straight." Oliver looked at her sharply. "She's not who she pretends to be. I don't mean she's dangerous," he added quickly, "but I wouldn't be surprised if she's hiding something." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "What makes you say that?" "She knew about the hidden room in the East Wing," he said, lowering his voice. "Only the family knows about it. It's behind the false panel in the library wall. When we were teenagers, Henry and I used to use it as a hiding spot. No one's been in there for years. But yesterday, just after she came back, I saw her looking at that panel like she was about to open it. When I asked her why, she said it was nothing." Miss Marple didn't react outwardly, but her mind stirred. A hidden room, a missing girl, a return with different shoes and a practiced smile, a black wig pin on the floor, a locked room that shouldn't have allowed exit. She began to see the vague shape of something beneath the surface, just the outline, still blurred. That night she waited until the house was quiet. Slipping a shawl over her shoulders, she made her way silently through the hallways, down the narrow passage behind the drawing room and into the library. The scent of pipe smoke still hung faintly in the air. She moved to the far wall, ran her hand along the moulding, and paused where the pattern of the wood slightly shifted. A soft push, a faint click, and the panel creaked open. Inside, the space was cramped and dusty, but not untouched. A chair had been dragged into the corner. A shawl, cheap and worn, lay folded over it. A biscuit tin sat beside it, half empty, and on the floor was a pair of high-heeled shoes, mud on the soles. Not Sylvia's. Miss Marple closed the panel, carefully, her heart beating just a little faster. It wasn't fear. It was clarity. Sylvia had not vanished. She had hidden, or someone had hidden her, and then returned in her place, wearing her dress, walking her walk, but not her shoes, which raised a question Miss Marple had only begun to consider. If the girl who returned wasn't Sylvia Langley, then who was she? She returned to her room quietly, the wheels of her mind turning with grim elegance. Somewhere in this house, someone was playing a part. Someone had misjudged the audience, and Miss Marple, knitting quietly in a corner, had just begun to unravel the threads. The morning sun filtered through thin curtains as the Harwood estate stirred with cautious quiet, the usual post-wedding, haze now tinged with uncertainty. Miss Marple was already dressed and seated on the terrace when Inspector Creighton returned unannounced, called back, he claimed, by a nagging sense of unfinished business. Miss Marple suspected otherwise. The inspector had the look of a man troubled by details he couldn't quite place, and his polite exchange with her over a second cup of tea confirmed it. He had received an anonymous letter dropped at the station, unsigned and untraceable. Its message was simple. The girl who came back is not the girl who left. That afternoon, with subtle prompting from Miss Marple, Creighton initiated a round of quiet interviews. No formal procedure, no pressure. Just polite conversation and light questioning, to see what surfaced when memories began to contradict. Miss Marple joined him not as a participant, but as a presence, knitting in a corner, unassuming and unthreatening, yet noting every twitch of hesitation and shift of tone. The first to speak was Daphne's brother, Henry. His usual boisterousness was curbed, but his voice retained its youthful charm. "I thought the whole thing was overblown," he said, shrugging. "Sylvia always had a bit of a dramatic streak. Wouldn't be the first time she pulled something odd." Creighton tilted his head. "So you weren't worried when she vanished?" "I mean, yes, of course I was," Henry corrected quickly. "But then she came back, didn't she? Seemed perfectly fine." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "And yet?" "You seemed quite deep in conversation with her yesterday evening." Henry blinked. "Just catching up. She wanted to know about the garden path, oddly enough. Said she remembered it differently." He laughed nervously. "Probably just the light." Creighton nodded, jotting it down, but Miss Marple caught it. The slight delay before, oddly enough, as if rehearsed, or borrowed from someone else's explanation. Next came Mrs. Parsons, the housekeeper, who seemed flustered from the outset. "I'd told Mr. Harwood it was a mistake to move everything up so quickly. The house wasn't ready. All these guests and Miss Langley's disappearance on top of it. It's been chaos." "You saw her when she returned?" Creighton asked. "Yes. She came down from the east staircase around 5 in the evening. Said she'd gotten lost in the woods." Mrs. Parsons pursed her lips. "But her hair was perfect. Not a twig out of place. I've seen girls come in from the hedge maze looking like they've been through a briar patch. And that's only 20 minutes' walk." Miss Marple leaned forward gently. "And she asked you to clean the room, didn't she?" She didn't ask directly, but she said something about wanting things tidy before dinner. Seemed awfully calm, given what had just happened. Henry had said she came from the garden. Parsons said she'd come from the east stairs. A contradiction, but one that might be attributed to poor memory. Still, it lingered. Then came the bride. Daphne looked exhausted, but the rigid politeness of her upbringing kept her posture perfect and her answers measured. "Sylvia and I were never particularly close, but I never wished her ill. I assumed she had cold feet about the ceremony, and perhaps a touch of nerves. She said she was lost in the woods," Creighton reminded her. Daphne gave a tight smile. She's always had a talent for rewriting her own story. It was part of her charm when we were children. You didn't notice anything different about her? Miss Marple asked. Daphne's eyes flicked for a second, too quick to register with anyone else. Only that she apologized. Sylvia doesn't apologize easily. Miss Marple said nothing, but the word lingered in her mind. A girl who didn't apologize had returned acting like one who did. The more witnesses they questioned, the clearer. It became that something essential about Sylvia had changed, just subtly enough to slip past casual scrutiny. But memory, Miss Marple knew, was a tapestry. Pull one wrong thread, and the whole thing began to unravel. When Sylvia herself was questioned, she maintained the same serene composure as before. "I truly didn't think my absence would cause such a fuss," she said, her voice light. "It wasn't my intention to be the center of attention." "Where did you go exactly?" Creighton asked. "I can't say. I walked a while, got turned around, found a stream, read a little." Miss Marple watched closely. "Read?" Sylvia paused for just a second. "Yes, I had a book in my handbag." "And what was the title?" Sylvia's brow creased slightly, the smile thinning. "It was a collection of poetry. Byron, I think. But Elsie, the maid, had mentioned she never saw a book in the room, and Sylvia's handbag, when it was returned to her, had nothing in it but a mirror and a lipstick. A small lie, harmless perhaps, but unnecessary, unless one was trying too hard to seem plausible." After Sylvia left the room, Creighton turned to Miss Marple. "She's lying about the book, at the very least." "Yes," Miss Marple said, knitting slowly, "but it isn't the lie itself that matters. It's the reason for it. She didn't walk in the woods. She wasn't alone. She never left the house at all." Creighton frowned. "You think someone's covering for her?" "I think someone's impersonating her," Miss Marple said softly. "But only for a little while. Just long enough to establish her return. The question is, where is the real Sylvia?" They sat in silence a moment longer. Creighton tapped his pen against his notebook. "Do you think she's alive?" "I think," Miss Marple said, eyes distant, "we shall find out very soon, because someone's story will collapse under the weight of its own convenience. They always do." And as she returned to her room that evening, she found a folded scrap of paper tucked beneath her door. In neat, unfamiliar handwriting it read, "I know what you've seen. Stop asking questions." She held it in the candlelight, unmoved. Now they were nervous. Now the real story was beginning to shake loose. The note left under Miss Marple's door didn't rattle her. If anything, it affirmed what she already suspected. Someone in the house had grown uncomfortable with her quiet probing. She read it once more that morning before tucking it into her knitting bag and heading downstairs, where the Harwood household was reeling under a veneer of civility. The staff moved with exaggerated cheer, and the family clung to routine. But underneath, the atmosphere had changed. There were too many glances over shoulders, too many silences thick with calculation. A lie, Miss Marple knew, was easier to weigh, maintain in isolation. But when several people were entangled in different versions of the same event, the effort of consistency became their undoing. Inspector Creighton agreed to continue the questioning, this time focusing on the possible why. Miss Marple asked for permission to speak with each person in private, less formal, less intimidating, but more revealing. She began with Henry, who had always spoken with the careless openness of youth. But this time his charm felt brittle. "I didn't know anything about a second disappearance," he said quickly, eyes darting. "I never said it was the second," Miss Marple replied gently. Henry stiffened. Then after a pause he leaned in. "Look, I didn't say anything before because I didn't want to get Sylvia into trouble. A few days before the wedding, she told me she was thinking of leaving, said she didn't trust Oliver." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "She thought he was hiding something. Financial trouble, maybe. She said he was desperate to marry into the Harwood family. She even hinted that he was being blackmailed. That was something new. And suddenly, Oliver's early attention made more sense." She thanked Henry and made her way next to Mrs. Parsons, who had regained her composure and was more defensive than the day before. "I don't gossip, miss," she said firmly, "but I do know this house better than anyone, and if someone came and went unseen, they had help." "You think someone on staff aided them?" "Not staff," Mrs. Parsons said, folding a towel with unnecessary force. "But someone who knows the staff's blind spots, knows which corridor we clean at what hour, knows when the gardener is on break. That's not something you pick up in a day." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Sylvia had lived in the house as a child, but the girl who had returned hadn't known about the creaky floorboard in the green hall, nor the old service stair. Mrs. Parsons, by contrast, would have noticed someone moving through the house who didn't move quite right. She moved next to Daphne, who was pacing the library alone, her eyes sunken, lips pale. Miss Marple offered a quiet presence, and after a few moments of silence, Daphne spoke. "She said she forgave me," she whispered. "Sylvia, or whoever she is. She said she forgave me for the past. But I never asked her to." "What past, dear?" Daphne hesitated. "When we were teenagers, there was a boy, Colin. He was from the village, worked in the gardens. Sylvia fancied him, and she thought he liked her back. But he and we became involved in secret. When Sylvia found out, she was furious. That was when she disappeared the first time. It wasn't long, but she came back different, distant, like something had shifted." "Did she ever confront you again?" "Not directly, but I always felt she resented me. I thought we'd grown past it. But the way she said it, 'I forgive you,' it wasn't kindness. It was something else. Fear and jealousy. Love turned bitter. That was one motive. Then came Oliver, who didn't resist when asked to talk. If anything, he seemed relieved. 'I'll tell you the truth,' he said, 'because I feel like I'm standing in the middle of something, and everyone else knows the rules but me.' 'Go on,' Miss Marple encouraged. 'I was being blackmailed. Not by Sylvia, though. Someone was sending me letters threatening to reveal some old debts I had overseas. It would have ruined my reputation with the Harwoods. Then, 2 days before the wedding, the letters stopped. Just like that. Did you tell anyone?' I couldn't. I thought maybe the person had changed their mind, or gotten what they wanted. 'And you suspect Sylvia?' I did. But now, I don't know. The girl who came back, it didn't feel like her. She didn't look at me with suspicion. She looked at me like I was a stranger, and perhaps he was. If the real Sylvia had disappeared and been replaced, then the imposter would have no reason to continue the blackmail. Another thread." Miss Marple left him with a kind word, her thoughts now circling like crows over a maze. Sylvia had resented Daphne. Daphne had betrayed her once. Oliver was desperate to marry into the family, vulnerable to exposure. Henry knew of a plan, or said he did, and Mrs. Parsons had seen someone who didn't belong try to act like they did. Then there was Elsie. Miss Marple found her scrubbing silver in the pantry, too absorbed in her task to notice her approach. "Elsie, dear, may I ask you something?" The girl jumped, nodded. "Yes, miss?" "Did you ever speak with Sylvia?" Before she disappeared. "Not really, miss. She was polite but quiet." "And when she came back?" Elsie hesitated. "She asked me where the second-floor linen closet was." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "The one by the portrait of Lady Agnes?" "Yes, miss." "And did she find it?" "She didn't know which door it was. That's how I knew it wasn't her." Miss Marple said nothing. She only placed a hand lightly on Elsie's arm and walked slowly back toward her room. The pieces were converging now, overlapping like worn playing cards. Every suspect had a motive, but motives were rarely the full story. Greed, jealousy, fear, they stirred the pot, but someone still had to act. The girl who had returned was not Sylvia. She had known how to behave like Sylvia, but not how to move like her, not how to remember the nooks of her own childhood home. And whoever had posed as her had done so only long enough to quiet suspicion, long enough to distract. The real Sylvia had vanished. The imposter had performed. And now someone was working to cover it up. And as Miss Marple sat at her writing desk that evening reviewing her notes, a thought occurred with chilling clarity. If the real Sylvia had uncovered a secret that threatened someone, whether it was Daphne's betrayal, Oliver's debt, or something yet unseen, then her disappearance hadn't been a mistake. It had been necessary for someone. By the following day, the tension in the Harwood estate had taken on a new form, not dread, but a strange sense of relief, as if a storm had passed. That morning, just before breakfast, a groundskeeper stumbled upon a shallow grave in the wooded area beyond the east hedge, half covered by leaves and broken brambles. Inside lay the unmistakable figure of Sylvia Langley, her skin pale and still, her once pink bridesmaid dress muddied and torn. The discovery sent a jolt through the household. The girl everyone had believed had returned was in fact dead, and had been for at least 2 days. That meant the girl they had seen was someone else entirely. Inspector Creighton returned to the house at once, this time with a new energy, almost triumphant. A scarf had been found near the body, dark red and knotted at one end. Nearby were muddy footprints leading back toward the Harwood garden, matching a pair of old boots found in the servants' storage. The scarf, as it happened, belonged to Mrs. Parsons, and the boots were her husband's, tucked away but recently worn. Confronted with the evidence, Mrs. Parsons broke down and confessed, though her confession was clumsy, tearful, and oddly disjointed. "She came back early," she sobbed. "She saw something she shouldn't have. I told her to keep quiet. I didn't mean to hurt her. I only meant to scare her off again. I didn't know it would go that far." Creighton took it as a confession of guilt. Within the hour, Mrs. Parsons was placed under arrest for the murder of Sylvia Langley. The staff watched in horror as she was led away in tears, protesting she hadn't meant for it to happen. Creighton declared the case closed by lunchtime and spoke to the family in a composed, clipped manner, assuring them there would be no further disruption. Miss Marple stood beside the piano, quiet, thoughtful, her knitting untouched beside her, on the settee. Something didn't sit right. The confession was too eager. too neatly aligned with the physical evidence. Mrs. Parsons had been frightened, yes, but not calculating, and most of all, she had said nothing about the impersonation. She believed Sylvia had returned, then vanished again. But Miss Marple knew the truth. The Sylvia who reappeared had never been Sylvia at all, and whoever had planted the scarf and the boots had wanted someone found guilty quickly, someone who could be believed capable of passion and fear, but not someone clever enough to orchestrate a substitution. That evening, Miss Marple walked the garden paths slowly, turning over the chain of events with meticulous care. The real Sylvia had likely discovered something, blackmail perhaps, or a hidden affair. She had vanished from her dressing room, most likely lured or tricked into leaving it without suspicion. She had either been killed then or held briefly in the hidden room behind the panel. Then, when the moment was right, someone, likely a woman of similar build, had donned her dress, altered her appearance slightly, and returned in her place. The return served two purposes: to buy time and to shut down alarm. But once Sylvia's body was found, the impersonator needed someone else to take the blame. And who better than the one woman in the house who had reason to resent Sylvia and who had already suspected something was wrong? Miss Marple returned to the east wing, to the dressing room where it had all begun. She stood at the doorway, looking in. The lilies had withered now, the air gone stale. Her eyes swept the room again, landing once more on the mirror. But something clicked this time. The mirror, it was a newer model, mounted on a hinge rather than fixed. Slowly, she stepped forward and opened the side panel. Behind it, faint but visible, was a smudge, powdery, grey, the outline of a face pressed too close. Someone had used it to adjust their appearance, possibly in a hurry. She walked to the wardrobe and opened it again, her hand tracing the edge. At the very back, a false panel. She hadn't noticed it before. It was slightly ajar. Inside was a folded piece of silk, pale pink, like the original dress Sylvia had worn. Not the same one, but a second dress, a copy. The Sylvia who returned hadn't changed into her dress in that room. She had arrived already dressed. That meant the substitution had occurred before the alarm was raised. Someone had waited until the house was busy, until the hairdresser stepped out, and then made the switch. Returning to her room, Miss Marple took out her notebook and listed the names of every woman in the house who could plausibly pass as Sylvia. Similar height, similar build, and access to the estate without scrutiny. She crossed out the staff, too visible, then paused at one name. Emily Fane, a cousin from Oliver's side. Quiet, polite, present at the rehearsal dinner but notably absent from the wedding itself, claiming illness. No one had seen her since the night Sylvia disappeared. Miss Marple knocked on Creighton's door that evening. "Forgive the interruption," she said, "but I wonder if anyone has confirmed Miss Emily Fane's whereabouts since the wedding." Creighton blinked. "Emily? She left the morning after. Said she had a migraine. Did anyone see her leave? I believe Oliver arranged a driver. Then we must speak to the driver." Half an hour later, the man, nervous and middle-aged, confirmed he had taken someone to the station. But it hadn't been Emily. It had been Henry, wearing a cloak and scarf, saying she was feeling too ill to be seen. The ticket had been paid for in cash. The platform staff couldn't recall a face. Just a slight woman in a wide hat who boarded the train alone. Miss Marple sat back and folded her hands. Emily had impersonated Sylvia. Sylvia had likely discovered something dangerous and confided in the wrong person. Emily, caught in the middle, had been persuaded or coerced to take her place, to prevent suspicion from falling where it should, and now Emily was gone. The real culprit remained in the house, quietly watching as suspicion was heaped onto someone else's shoulders. As the house settled again that night, confident in the inspector's announcement of justice, Miss Marple knew it was a false victory. The true killer had traded risk for silence and sacrificed a woman clever enough to deceive a house full of people. But the deception had frayed. The real game was only now revealing its final hand. It was well after midnight when Miss Marple sat again in the drawing-room, her thoughts weaving backwards instead of forward. The false confession, the real Sylvia's death, the vanishing of Emily Fane, the planted clues, it had all built toward an illusion of closure. But something still rippled beneath the surface. The neatness of the setup had been too deliberate, the motive too shallow. One did not impersonate a bridesmaid simply to protect an inheritance or avoid scandal. The impersonation had not been an act of desperation. It had been part of something larger, something older. And Miss Marple had learned over the years that the most successful crimes often wore the mask of the present while growing roots deep in the soil of long-forgotten history. She began again with the names, not just the Harwoods and their inner circle, but those who lingered on the edges, servants, cousins, guests not mentioned. She asked for the guest book, which had been left in the hallway near the main entrance. By the light of a dim lamp, she flipped through the pages, noting familiar signatures and a few she didn't recognize. One in particular stood out, R. Hargreaves. A discreet, tight script, tucked between pages filled with florid scrawls and extravagant greetings. She asked the butler about it the next morning, and he shrugged. I believe that was one of the E2 guests from the groom's side. Didn't stay overnight. Left before the ceremony. R. Hargreaves. A name she hadn't heard in years, but one that stirred something old in her memory. She retired to her room and searched her correspondence, trunk, where she kept old letters from friends who had passed on, or who had once shared with her pieces of gossip too subtle for the newspapers. And there it was, in a letter from an old schoolmistress acquaintance. A case in Sussex, 20 years ago, a theft at a girls' school, jewelry stolen from multiple students. The culprit had been a maid, dismissed quietly, never prosecuted, due to family influence. The maid's name had been Ruth Hargreaves. It hadn't made the papers, but the letter detailed the affair with uncharacteristic bitterness. The girl had been protected, not for her innocence, but for what she knew. Something about a teacher's indiscretion. She had been sent abroad, quietly, before the scandal could spread. Miss Marple remembered thinking then that it would not be the girl's last trouble. And now the same name appeared here, years later, among the wedding guests. Not on the bride's side. On the groom's, Oliver Fane. Respectable, soft-spoken, seemingly stressed by debt. But what if the truth was that he hadn't merely been blackmailed? What if he had once known Ruth Hargreaves? What if the connection between them wasn't accidental at all? The more she considered it, the clearer the shape of the buried past became. Sylvia Langley had returned from abroad not only for her cousin's wedding but also with questions of her own. She had grown curious, perhaps suspicious. She had overheard something, discovered something, and she had told someone, perhaps even Emily, that there were pieces of the past that didn't add up. That the man her cousin was about to marry was not who he claimed to be, and it wasn't just the signature that mattered. It was the scarf, the one supposedly belonging to Mrs. Parsons. It had been new, not worn, with a faint perfume too modern for Mrs. Parsons' usual taste. That scent had nagged at Miss Marple from the beginning. She now remembered where she had first noticed it, in the drawing room after Oliver left. The same sharp, citrusy note on the arm of the chair he had leaned against. So if the scarf hadn't belonged to Mrs. Parsons at all, who had planted it? Someone who knew Oliver. Someone who had once been part of that buried past. Ruth Hargreaves, perhaps not as vanished as once believed. She asked Creighton if any background had been done on Oliver's guests. He admitted no. The guest book had seemed irrelevant after the supposed confession. "I think," she said softly, "we must look again. Not at what Sylvia discovered this week, but what she may have uncovered from years ago." Reluctantly, Creighton requested records from the Fane family. The results were slow in arriving, but revealing. Oliver Fane had studied abroad for a time, in Geneva, and prior to that had been involved in an incident that had been sealed by the family solicitors. Nothing on paper, only a brief mention in a local archive. Theft from a family friend's estate during a summer gathering, no charges, filed but a quiet dismissal from his father's business shortly thereafter. The stolen items? Jewelry. Untraceable. Never recovered. The only other name attached to the gathering was an employee, a companion hired for the summer, a woman named Ruth Hargreaves. The connection was now more than coincidence. Miss Marple's theory solidified with chilling precision. Ruth and Oliver had been involved in something together years ago, a theft, perhaps a betrayal. They had covered their tracks, but Sylvia, curious and sharp, had begun to notice the inconsistencies. Maybe she found a photo. Maybe she recognized a name from her own travels. Whatever she uncovered had prompted her to investigate further, and when she did, someone panicked. Sylvia had to disappear, and Ruth, still loyal or perhaps still entangled, had returned under another name, just long enough to play Sylvia's part, just long enough to mislead the investigation, then vanished again. But if Ruth had come back, then someone in the house had helped her enter unseen. That someone had to be Oliver, which meant that all of it, the blackmail, the false confession, the evidence against Mrs. Parsons, had been orchestrated not to protect him from Sylvia's death, but from the truth of his past. Miss Marple stood quietly in the hallway, staring at the family portraits. In one, a younger Daphne stood with her parents and Sylvia. Another, more recent, showed Daphne and Oliver, framed and placed just last week. But it wasn't the subjects that held her gaze. It was the edges of the frames, a fresh scratch on the wall near the newer portrait, barely noticeable. But someone had taken it down recently. She stepped closer, removed the frame, and behind it, lodged in the wooden recess, was a folded piece of paper. A letter, addressed to Daphne in Sylvia's handwriting. The ink smudged, but the final lines still legible. "You must be careful. Oliver's past is not what he says. I found someone, Ruth H. She remembers. She's frightened. I think she may try to disappear again. If anything happens to me." The rest was torn. Miss Marple replaced the frame carefully. The truth had been there all along, hanging behind glass, in silence. The shadows of the past had never left. They had only waited to be noticed. The letter hidden behind the portrait confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicion. Sylvia had been close, too close, to a truth buried for decades. But even as the evidence quietly amassed, it remained circumstantial. The scarf, the false signature, the vanished guest, the hidden letter, all threads pointing to Ruth Hargreaves and Oliver Fane, yet none offering a firm enough hold to draw them into the open. Miss Marple knew better than to confront someone directly when they had built their lies carefully. The truth would only surface when their control slipped. She would have to make it slip. She spent the next morning in the drawing room as usual, but this time she requested Daphne's help with a peculiar task. Together, they laid out old family photographs on the table, ostensibly sorting them for a commemorative album. Miss Marple made certain it was done in the main room, where anyone passing through could see. As expected, Oliver wandered in just after tea, pausing when he saw the photographs and asking, almost too casually, what they were doing. "We thought we'd mark the occasion with a little visual history," Miss Marple said sweetly, "though some of these faces are rather mysterious." She tapped a photo near the corner, one that had no date or names written on it. A summer gathering by a fountain, young girls in white frocks, a few gentlemen in wide lapels, and in the background 2 women slightly removed from the group. One of them had unmistakably sharp cheekbones, dark hair pinned tightly back, and a stare that was too direct for a servant. "I believe this was taken at Ashcombe Hall," Miss Marple murmured. "Do you happen to recall who these 2 ladies are, Mr. Fane?" Oliver barely glanced at it. "No idea. Probably staff. Hard to tell after all these years." Miss Marple said lightly. "That one looks so familiar. Reminds me of someone who signed your guest book last week." "What was the name?" "Hargreaves." Oliver's throat moved once in a swallow. "I didn't know the guest list very well. Daphne handled most of it." "But you arranged a car for Miss Emily Fane, didn't you, after the wedding?" "Yes, she asked me to. I assumed she wasn't well." Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. "How curious. Daphne tells me she never received a note from Emily, and yet you took care of it promptly. Quite considerate." He didn't answer. Instead, he glanced at the photo again, then turned to leave with a muttered excuse about estate matters. It wasn't panic. It was something subtler, a retreat, a tightening of his surface. The moment he left, Miss Marple turned to Daphne. "I need a favour, my dear. Might we announce a small gathering this evening? Nothing formal. Just a light supper with a game or 2. A distraction, I suppose, after the terrible days we've had." Daphne blinked, then nodded. "Of course, you think someone might say something if they feel relaxed?" "Not quite," Miss Marple said, already rising. "I think someone will show something, if they believe they're not being watched." That evening, the guests gathered in the drawing room under the soft glow of the chandelier. Wine was poured, light music played. Miss Marple took her usual place near the fireplace, knitting and smiling, occasionally chiming in with innocent comments. The game was simple. Guests were asked to recall unusual words they had heard or seen during the week. It began as a harmless memory challenge, one suggested by Miss Marple, who claimed it sharpened the mind. People laughed, played along. Creighton, watching quietly from a corner, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. When it was Oliver's turn, he hesitated, then said, "Someone used the word alabaster in a toast." "Very poetic," Miss Marple said. "Was that before or after Sylvia disappeared?" He paused again. "Before, I believe." "Curious," she murmured, "because Sylvia was the one who used that word, but she never made a toast. Not aloud, only in writing." Oliver looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "She wrote it in a note. A little one, left for her cousin. She said the wedding gown reminded her of alabaster. Daphne showed it. To me. You must have seen it too, then. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Just for a second. But Miss Marple saw the hesitation. A flicker of calculation. The word had trapped him. It had slipped from memory, a fragment of the role his accomplice had played. If he hadn't seen Sylvia's note, how could he know the word? The room resumed its chatter, unaware of the undercurrent. But Creighton saw it now, too. After the guests drifted away, Miss Marple spoke quietly with him in the hallway. It was a trap, she said. A simple word. Nothing damning. But if he had truly never spoken to Sylvia before the wedding, he could not have known she wrote that word, unless someone told him, someone who was pretending to be her. Creighton nodded slowly. We'll bring him in again. Press harder. No, Miss Marple said. He won't break that way, not yet. He needs to believe the past is truly buried, and then, when he's certain he's safe, he'll try to vanish, like Ruth did. And what then? Then we'll follow, and when he tries to meet her again, because he must, he'll lead us to the final answer. Later that night, Miss Marple returned to her room, the fire burning low, her knitting idle in her lap. The house was quiet once more, but her thoughts were not. The crack had appeared, not wide enough to see through yet, but there. The truth had been touched, if only faintly, and soon, with the right nudge, it would break open. The next morning arrived shrouded in a cold mist that clung to the windows like breath on glass. The estate, though bustling with routine, carried an unspoken tension, something underneath. The surface had shifted. Miss Marple noticed it first in the kitchen, where the staff, usually open with their morning chatter, were hushed and abrupt. Creighton had returned early, and one look at his face confirmed her suspicion. Something had happened. He met her in the study, his tone low, the edges of his voice rough with frustration. "The letter," he said. "Sylvia's note, the one behind the portrait. It's gone." Miss Marple didn't flinch. "You removed." "It didn't you. I left it in place," he admitted. "We wanted to observe reactions, see who might return to it. Only the family and I knew. And now it's been taken." He nodded. "Not just taken. The back panel's been pried open. Clean, no damage. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were after." Miss Marple closed, her eyes briefly, then opened them with a calm resolve. "Then we are closer than we thought. So close, in fact, that someone now believes the truth must be erased. Completely." They agreed to keep the loss quiet for now, announcing it would only serve to flush the criminal prematurely, and the game was not yet fully laid. But the loss changed the nature of the investigation. No longer was it a quiet, deliberate search. Now, the criminal was reacting, intervening. The battle for truth had become active. Miss Marple spent the rest of the day revisiting details with fresh eyes. Every event was now seen through the lens of desperation. The impersonation, the planted scarf, the vanished Ruth, all of it carefully choreographed, yet vulnerable to collapse. And now someone had risked entering the house again, unnoticed, to remove a document hidden behind a picture frame. That suggested intimate knowledge, not just of the estate, but of its habits. Someone still present, watching. In the afternoon, she requested a small task of Daphne, a list of everyone who had entered the drawing room in the past 2 days. Staff, guests, family. Daphne was puzzled but complied, handing her a sheet with a dozen names by tea time. Most were expected, guests saying good night, a housemaid tidying the curtains, Henry looking for his cufflinks. But one name stood out, because it hadn't been mentioned before: Agnes Blackwell. She was a distant cousin, Daphne explained, a woman from the extended Fane branch staying at the nearby inn. She'd dropped by briefly, unannounced, to deliver a forgotten gift for the bride. No one had thought anything of it at the time. Miss Marple walked to the inn just before dusk. The fog was thickening, and the lights of the village glowed softly through it like distant lanterns. The innkeeper, a cheerful man with too little time, remembered Agnes well. Yes, stayed 2 nights. Said she had to head up north for business. But she left yesterday morning. Odd sort, to be honest. Didn't eat much. Kept to herself. Did she give any details about her business? He shook his head. Said she worked in import services. Never said what she was importing. Miss Marple thanked him and returned to the estate, her mind already miles ahead. Agnes Blackwell. A fabricated identity, most likely. Another layer, another mask. Ruth Hargreaves by any other name. The timing matched. The manner matched. And now, with the letter gone, Ruth had vanished again. She found Creighton pacing outside the library, cigarette barely lit between his fingers. "She's gone again," Miss Marple said, and explained the innkeeper's account. Creighton exhaled slowly. "This woman, she's not just helping. She's orchestrating. She's cleaning up behind him." "She's always been the planner," Miss Marple agreed. "Oliver needs her because he reacts, but she thinks ahead. She understood that Sylvia's death could be explained away. But that letter couldn't. It linked the past to the present. So she came back for it, cleverly, quietly." Creighton ground out the cigarette, jaw tight. "I'll send men to the station, the buses, the main road. We might still catch her." Miss Marple placed a hand on his arm. "We won't. She's already gone. But the damage was done." The single document that confirmed Sylvia's suspicions, that directly named Ruth Hargreaves and warned of Oliver's past, was no longer evidence. The remaining clues were fractured and circumstantial. Miss Marple knew the truth, but without proof the noose could not yet tighten. That night dinner was served with forced gaiety. Daphne smiled too brightly. Oliver made small talk that sounded hollow. Henry avoided eye contact. And through it all, Miss Marple watched. She was no longer waiting for someone to slip. She was waiting for someone to flinch. When dessert was served, Daphne rose and asked everyone to raise their glasses for Sylvia. A tribute, she said, for her cousin's memory. There was silence as the guests lifted their glasses. Then Oliver stood, voice stiff. "To Sylvia, may she rest in peace." But he didn't drink, just lifted the glass and set it down, untouched. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Ruth had always been the strategist, but Oliver was unraveling. That much was now certain. After dinner, Miss Marple caught Creighton by the study. "He's nervous," she said. "His control is fraying. Ruth is gone, and he knows what that means. She's cleaned up after him, but she's also left him alone." Creighton nodded grimly. "We'll keep watching. He'll break." "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "He won't break. He'll act. That's the difference. He's not trying to survive this quietly. He's preparing to run. Or worse, to silence anyone who might still expose him." And that, Miss Marple realized, was the danger now. The stolen letter hadn't just been a defensive move. It had bought Oliver time. Time to plan a final step. One that would leave no more evidence, one that would silence the last voice left. That could speak the truth, because Sylvia had written more than one letter, and Miss Marple knew where the second one was, the one she hadn't told anyone about yet, and someone else knew it too. The wind howled through the Harwood estate that night like a warning, sharp, insistent, dragging dry leaves across the windows with restless claws. Inside, the rooms were warm, but a chill sat under every conversation. Even the candles seemed to flicker more than usual, as if disturbed by some invisible breath. Miss Marple, now fully aware that someone in the house knew of Sylvia's second letter, had taken a quiet precaution. She removed the note from its hiding place beneath the lining of her knitting basket and placed it into the hollow base of her walking stick, which unscrewed with a gentle twist. It was a trick she'd used before in other unpleasant times, rarely necessary, but useful now. The letter was brief, written in Sylvia's sharp, slanted hand, and addressed to a Miss Eleanor Smythe, a friend in London. It hadn't been posted. Sylvia had hidden it in the drawer of an old secretary desk in her room, folded behind a cracked mirror panel that Miss Marple had found days earlier. In the letter, Sylvia wrote about a woman named R.H., who had reappeared under a false name and warned that she feared someone close to the groom was lying about their past. She hadn't named Oliver directly, but she hadn't needed to. The implication was clear. That night, just after midnight, a scream tore through the stillness. Not long, not theatrical, just a short, sharp cry that cut the air and died abruptly. Miss Marple was already up and in her robe. Creighton arrived seconds later, having been sleeping lightly since the evidence had vanished. They moved quickly, following the sound to the far end of the east wing, to one of the guest rooms. The door to Henry's room was ajar. Inside, the smell of burnt candle wax hung heavy in the air, and on the floor, crumpled against the foot of the bed, was Henry Harwood, unmoving. Creighton knelt beside him while Miss Marple examined the surroundings. No signs of forced entry, no broken window, a single overturned chair. But Henry's collar was pulled askew, and there was a fresh red mark across his temple. A blow, clean, deliberate. Creighton touched his throat and swore softly. He's still, breathing, but only just. A doctor was called. In the chaos, Miss Marple quietly slipped away and returned to her room. She hadn't brought her walking stick with her that evening. And now, as she feared, it was gone. The secret letter, her last remaining proof, had vanished with it. She said nothing of this to Creighton until Henry had been stabilized and carried down to the drawing room, unconscious but alive. Then she told him everything. About the letter. The hiding place, the theft. Creighton's face was stone. You're certain someone knew where it was? I'm certain someone followed me, or guessed. Either way, they acted tonight to remove it and to silence Henry. Why Henry? He knew, or he was about to say something. He's young, impulsive. I think he recognized the impersonator earlier than he let on. Perhaps he even helped Sylvia with part of her plan, maybe retrieving the photograph, helping her plant something. But fear makes people retreat, and guilt makes them talk too late. Creighton paced the hallway. So we have a missing woman, Ruth Hargreaves, an accomplice groom with a buried past, a missing letter, and now an attempted murder, and no hard evidence for any of it. Miss Marple met his gaze. Which means we must act before the next step is taken, because they won't stop. Henry lived, but that was luck. If we wait, the next time will be worse. They've begun erasing anything and anyone who ties them to Sylvia's death. In the silence that followed, the door to the study creaked open. Daphne stood there, pale but composed. "I heard," she said. "About Henry. Is he—" "He'll live," Creighton said. Daphne looked at Miss Marple. "I know who it is. I didn't want to admit it before. I thought it would ruin everything. But now I see what she's done." Miss Marple stepped forward. "Ruth?" Daphne nodded. "She wasn't a guest. She was hired by Oliver. She was meant to assist with wedding coordination. I thought it strange at the time. He said she was an old family contact. She kept to herself, but I remember the day Sylvia went missing. I saw Ruth near the East Wing, dressed strangely. She wasn't wearing her usual uniform. And then, suddenly, she wasn't Ruth anymore." "She was Sylvia." Miss Marple's voice was steady. "Why didn't you say anything?" Daphne looked away. "Because I thought maybe Sylvia had asked her to help with something. A prank, something harmless. And then when Sylvia came back, I assumed I'd imagined it. But it wasn't Sylvia. I know that now. I always knew, but I was afraid." Creighton's face darkened. "Do you know where Oliver is now?" "He left after dinner. Said he had a headache. But I just went to his room. He's not there. His car's gone." Miss Marple breathed in slowly. "He's going to meet her. Ruth. They planned this all along. Remove the threats. Disappear together." Creighton was already moving. "I'll radio the station. We'll set up roadblocks." But Miss Marple was shaking her head. "You won't catch them on the road, not yet. They'll wait somewhere safe, somewhere familiar. They'll try to remove the last piece that links them to this place. The body." Miss Marple nodded. "Sylvia's." Creighton froze, then ran. Within minutes, they were heading toward the woods behind the estate, where Sylvia's body had first been found. The moon was high now, slicing through branches, painting white lines across the underbrush. Near the site, a fresh patch of disturbed earth glistened. And beside it, two figures. Ruth Hargreaves, dirt-streaked, sleeves rolled high. And beside, her Oliver holding a lantern, one hand gripping a shovel. They didn't run, they froze. Creighton's voice boomed. "Step away!" Miss Marple remained still, watching the two of them, their masks finally stripped. Ruth, pale but composed, her face devoid of remorse. Oliver, shaking, more from fear than cold. "You should have burned the letter the first time," Miss Marple said softly, almost to herself. "But no matter. You left your fingerprints on everything else." Creighton's men moved forward. Oliver dropped the lantern. The glow sputtered out. But the truth, finally, had no more shadows to hide in. The dawn that broke over Harwood Estate was a quiet one, not triumphant, not mournful, just still. Oliver Fane and Ruth Hargreaves had been taken into custody before the sun had risen, their hands bound by more than shackles, by silence, denial, and a story that could no longer hold itself upright. Creighton's men had cordoned off the wooded site, and Sylvia's body, undisturbed but cruelly repositioned by her killers, was left with dignity this time as the coroner prepared for removal. Miss Marple did not go back inside. She remained on the edge of the clearing, standing among the twisted trees and wet leaves, her breath visible in the chill air, her thoughts moving through the threads of the past like fingers across embroidery. Something still tugged at her. Oliver had confessed in pieces. Not out of remorse, but pressure, as the details became impossible to deny. He'd met Ruth years ago, first as an accomplice in the thefts of youth, then as a partner in schemes more refined. Sylvia, clever and persistent, had connected too many dots. The impersonation had been Ruth's idea. Ruth could observe, mimic, adapt, disappear as easily as she arrived. Sylvia's death had not been planned initially, but once she had gotten too close, her silence had become essential. The rest, planting evidence, impersonating her vanishing again, had all unfolded with ruthless calculation. And yet Miss Marple could not shake the sense that something still didn't align. The big picture held. The roles, the motives, the cover-up. But there had been a moment, just a small one, that refused to fit. A detail that had surfaced in passing, then faded again before it could root. She returned to the estate with the others, but not to rest. She went to the drawing room and stood once more before the portrait of Daphne and Oliver. Her gaze flicked to the back panel, now sealed again after the removal of the first letter. But that wasn't what had stayed with her. It was the placement of the frame itself, the faint scratch along the plaster. She stepped back and examined the wall. The scratch wasn't from opening the panel. It was from adjusting the picture itself, raising it slightly. Why? She reached for the frame and gently tilted it forward again. A tiny note, smaller than a calling card, fluttered down. It wasn't Sylvia's handwriting. It was printed, deliberately, just 3 words. She found me. Miss Marple sat with the note in her lap for several minutes before going to Creighton. He stared at it, grim. This wasn't from Sylvia, he said. You're sure? I believe. It was from Ruth. And I believe it explains everything she didn't say aloud. He frowned. She said Sylvia approached her, that they argued, that Sylvia accused her of past crimes and threatened to expose them both. Miss Marple nodded. That part is likely true. But Ruth also claimed that Sylvia's death was a matter of panic. An accident. That's where the lie hides. Ruth was never caught off guard. This note, it wasn't fear. It was warning. To Oliver, she found me. Sylvia wasn't confronting Ruth in secret. Ruth had been watching her, and Sylvia found her first. Creighton leaned back. So you think Ruth didn't act out of panic at all? She acted to protect herself. And more than that, Miss Marple said softly, she acted to protect something else, something even Sylvia may not have understood. She rose and returned to the east wing. Henry was still unconscious, the doctor seated beside him with an expression of cautious optimism. Miss Marple didn't disturb them. Instead, she moved towards Sylvia's old room again. The desk, the wardrobe, the dressing table. She opened each one slowly, remembering every item she'd seen before. Then, by habit more than thought, she turned to the wardrobe and ran her hand along the back panel. This time she didn't find silk or powder. She found a paper bag tucked between the wood and the plaster. Inside was a small velvet box. She opened it. A ring. It was simple, but unmistakably old. A carved band of gold set with a single deep blue sapphire. She blinked. This wasn't Sylvia's. It had been referenced once offhand by Daphne during the earliest interviews. A family ring, lost generations ago. No one had seen it in decades. No one had even looked for it. Miss Marple took the box to Daphne that evening and handed it over without a word. Daphne opened it and gasped. "Where did you find this, Sylvia?" "Hid it." I think she found it before the wedding, or perhaps much earlier, but she never told anyone. Daphne held the ring delicately. I remember this. My grandmother wore it always. It was supposed to pass to Sylvia eventually, Miss Marple nodded, which makes it rather odd that Ruth had it in her possession, don't you think? Daphne looked up slowly, eyes widening. You're saying Ruth stole it? Or was given? It, Miss Marple said. By Oliver. Daphne dropped the ring back into the box. The pattern had emerged fully now, not just one of murder and impersonation, but one of inheritance, old resentments, and hidden loyalties. The ring was no ordinary keepsake. It marked status in the Harwood line, a subtle symbol of legitimacy. If Sylvia had shown it publicly, if she had worn it, it would have meant something more than nostalgia. It would have confirmed her as the true heir, both emotionally and financially, in ways that would have cast long shadows over Daphne's engagement. Miss Marple spoke quietly. I think Sylvia found this ring days before the wedding, perhaps while searching through the old family trunks, perhaps by accident, and I think she realized it had never been lost at all, that someone, Oliver likely, had taken it from the estate before and kept it hidden, perhaps as a gift for Ruth, or as a bargaining chip. Either way, it proved something Sylvia could not ignore, that her cousin, the woman meant to marry into the family, had lied about more than just her identity, and that Oliver was part of it. Daphne's hand trembled slightly as she closed the lid. I should have known there were signs, but I didn't want to see them. We often don't, Miss Marple said, until the pattern becomes too large to ignore. That night, as the estate settled once more into uneasy quiet, Miss Marple sat with her hands folded in her lap. The case, in its outward shape, was finished. Ruth and Oliver would face justice. Sylvia's death would be recorded and explained. But what remained, what would linger in the corners of Harwood for years to come, was the realization that all of it, the vanishing, the deceit, the murder, had grown from a long-forgotten truth, a stolen ring, and a betrayal so old that no one had even remembered to ask about it, until someone, quietly, simply, had looked again. The morning after the ring's discovery brought with it no rain, no dramatic sunrise, just a muted grey that blanketed the sky, as though even the weather was reluctant to disturb the fragile stillness left in the wake of the unraveling truths. The house was quieter now. Daphne had withdrawn, pale and heavy-eyed, her movements subdued but deliberate, as if every step was now taken through the weight of something long suspected, but only now fully understood. Creighton had dispatched official reports to London, Ruth and Oliver both transported under guard to the nearest holding facility. The scandal, once concealed behind silk dresses and champagne flutes, had become something far more human and unsettling, a cold tapestry of betrayal stitched through generations. Yet, in the calm that followed, Miss Marple remained alert. Not in fear, but in knowing. The ring had explained the how, a clue to movement, to theft, to possession, but not the why. There was still a sliver of the story hidden beneath what had already been exposed. Something in Ruth's silence, in Oliver's incomplete confession, in Daphne's restrained collapse, suggested that the real cause was not simply greed or status. It was older, personal, and dangerously unresolved. Creighton met Miss Marple after breakfast in the study, weary but intrigued. "He's talking," he said without ceremony. "Oliver, finally." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And what has he decided to say?" Creighton rubbed his jaw. "He admitted he gave the ring to Ruth years ago, claimed it was a symbol. His word, not payment, not a prize, a bond. He said they had an agreement, something to keep them tied no matter where they went." She frowned, slow and deliberate. "So it wasn't just an affair or a shared past of petty crime?" "No." That's what he said next. He said Ruth wasn't just an accomplice. She was the one who made him feel seen. That everything he did, cheating, lying, even the marriage to Daphne, was all part of a plan she designed, a long one. Years in the making. Miss Marple didn't respond right away. Her thoughts drifted back to that first evening at Harwood before the wedding, before the disappearance, when Ruth, under another name, had watched from the periphery, her presence just barely noticed, like a ghost already rehearsing for her entrance. It hadn't been the act of someone pulled into a scheme. It had been someone executing the final step of a long-laid foundation. She told him he didn't matter, Creighton continued, that he was just a name, that men like him were always the same, takers, never thinkers. She said he owed her more than he understood. Miss Marple looked up. Did he believe her? I think so. He looked more frightened than ashamed, like he realized too late she was never following his lead. She stood slowly. Then the motive wasn't money. It wasn't even legacy, it was control. Creighton watched her closely. Explain. She wanted to disappear once before, Miss Marple said. Years ago, after the boarding school theft. She didn't want forgiveness or reinvention. She wanted to vanish and start again. But not alone. She wanted to create something that only she could define, a future dictated entirely by her rules. So she found Oliver, vulnerable, restless, eager to matter, and she offered him a way, but only if he stayed in her world, under her terms. He thought she loved him, but she didn't want a partner. She wanted a project. Creighton folded his arms. So, the impersonation, killing Sylvia. It wasn't just to avoid exposure. No, Sylvia threatened not just their safety, but the narrative. Sylvia uncovered the ring, yes, but more importantly, she began asking questions that Ruth had already answered in her mind. To Ruth, Sylvia represented a return to powerlessness, of being revealed, reduced, punished again. Ruth didn't kill for gain, she killed to protect her creation. And when Sylvia refused to play the part of a confused or frightened girl, Ruth replaced her, literally. Creighton exhaled, slow and troubled. It wasn't revenge. It was obsession. Yes, and control. Ruth didn't fear discovery as much as she feared being irrelevant. That's why she came back for the letter. Why she tried to bury the body again. Even her silence after arrest. It's not shame. It's defiance. Creighton was quiet for a while, then finally spoke. And Oliver. Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. He wanted to believe he was the one in control, the clever thief, the charmer. But Ruth made him believe he needed her to survive. So he obeyed, even when it cost him everything. Creighton shook his head. A twisted kind of loyalty. No, Miss Marple said gently. A twisted kind of dependency. The worst kind because it feels like purpose. That's why he tried to remove the body, not to escape. but to prove he still mattered to her. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, a crow called once, sharp and lonely. The fire crackled faintly in the grate. Then Creighton asked, "What of Daphne?" Miss Marple hesitated. "She will survive. She was deceived, yes, but not broken. Her tragedy isn't that she loved a fraud. It's that she stopped trusting herself long before she ever met him." Creighton stood, slow and thoughtful. "We'll file the final reports tomorrow. Full charges, both of them." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. Let the facts be recorded, but know the truth is deeper than paper. It always is." That evening, as the house began to empty and the staff returned to routine, Miss Marple sat by the window with her knitting. Her bag was open beside her, but she'd stopped counting rows. Her thoughts were elsewhere. On Ruth, who had wrapped her whole life around the belief that control was the only form of safety. On Oliver, who'd confused purpose with possession. And on Sylvia, whose death had not been about inheritance or status, but simply because she refused to vanish. The hidden motive had never been hidden at all. It had lived in every gesture, every silence, every choice, to stay invisible until it was time to strike. Not revenge, not greed, just the cold, quiet desire to reshape the world, one stolen identity at a time. The air at Harwood felt denser in the hours before the final act, as though the estate itself held its breath, anticipating resolution. Ruth had been silent during her transfer, eyes downcast, mouth fixed in a calm defiance that unnerved even the guards. Oliver had become increasingly agitated since their arrest, sleepless, erratic in his statements, shifting between anger and pitiful confusion. Creighton had arranged for them to be held in separate cells at the local station, but Miss Marple had asked for one final meeting before the formal charges were filed. It was just past dusk when she stepped into the narrow interview room where Ruth was seated, hands folded neatly before her, posture still impeccable. There was no handcuff, no physical restraint, just the psychological one Ruth had worn all her life, the conviction that her mind was always several steps ahead of everyone else. But for the first time, her gaze faltered when Miss Marple entered. Miss Marple didn't sit immediately. She set her walking stick aside, removed her gloves slowly, then fixed her eyes on Ruth with the same patience she used for tangled yarn. Not hurried, not hostile, but deliberate. "I've been thinking," Miss Marple said softly, "about the way you vanished all those years ago. You didn't run because you were afraid of punishment. You ran because you wanted to disappear on your own terms. Control, not escape." Ruth gave a thin smile. "You've said as much to the inspector, I'm sure." "I have," Miss Marple replied. "But what I haven't said is why I've come to speak with you now. It's not to hear a confession. I've no interest in the kind of truth that's shaped to suit you." Ruth tilted her head, amused. "Then what do you want?" "To give you one final chance to choose your ending." That made Ruth pause. Miss Marple went on. "You've spent your life avoiding exposure. You've changed names, rewritten histories, orchestrated events so precisely that even your own accomplice didn't understand you fully. But now your plan has collapsed. The truth is documented, the ring recovered, the impersonation traced. The very identity you tried to protect is the one now recorded under the name of a murderer." Ruth's voice was low but clear. "Then why offer me anything?" "Because you still have something left," Miss Marple said, stepping closer. Not freedom, not sympathy, but clarity. You can choose to end this as the woman who tried to outsmart the world and failed, or as someone who just once told the truth without twisting it. Silence followed. Ruth's fingers flexed slightly, her lips parted, then closed again. But her eyes were different now, less guarded, more tired. "You think I regret it?" she said at last. "No," Miss Marple answered. "You regret being caught. But I think you've begun to realize that all your careful planning didn't give you what you wanted. Control isn't power if you spend your life hiding behind it." A flicker of something, hurt perhaps, or memory, crossed Ruth's face. "I never meant for it to go that far," she said after a moment. "Sylvia was going to leave. I told her she could go, but she said she'd written letters, that it was too late to disappear quietly, that everything would come out anyway." "You knew then," Miss Marple said, "that she was beyond persuasion, so you silenced her." "I told Oliver to go to the wedding to play the part. I said I'd come later. I needed time to clean it up. But when I saw the letter wasn't where she said it would be, I panicked. I didn't realize she'd hidden another. And that," Miss Marple said gently, "was your mistake." Ruth laughed once, dry, brittle. "She was clever. That's what I hated most. She didn't try to expose me for vengeance or glory. She did it because she believed it was right. That's always the kind that ruin everything, the ones who still think truth is worth something." "She was right," Miss Marple said, "and now you can be too, not for redemption, but for dignity." Ruth said nothing more. She looked at her hands as if they no longer belonged to her. Miss Marple stepped away, collected her things, and paused at the door. "He would have let you go," she said, not turning back. "Oliver. You said he was just a name, but he would have followed you into whatever plan you made. Even now." Ruth's voice was barely a whisper. "That was the problem." Miss Marple left the room without another word. She walked to the next room, where Oliver sat with his head bowed, hands clasped tightly. Creighton stood nearby, watching, silently. "She's spoken," Miss Marple said. Oliver looked up, eyes bloodshot. "About me? She confirmed what we already know, that you were complicit, that you tried to hide the body. That you acted out of loyalty." He exhaled shakily. "Then that's it, isn't it?" "No," Miss Marple said. "There's still one more thing." He looked confused. "She left something behind for you. She won't say it directly, but it's clear she used you because she could, and yet even now you're the only one who could have stopped it." "She was many things, Oliver. But she wasn't invincible. She relied on your weakness." Oliver's mouth opened, but no words came. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "She didn't love you. She used you to tell a story where she never lost. And you helped write it, but you can end it differently. If you tell the truth now, every detail, every step, you take the pen away from her. For once." The room was quiet for a long time. Then Oliver leaned back and whispered. "She said we were the same, that I was just like her." "You're not," Miss Marple said, voice low. "You were merely afraid to be different." That night Creighton received 2 full statements. One from Ruth, parsed and carefully worded, but complete, and one from Oliver, longer, broken in places, but with all the missing details that had eluded them until now. How Ruth had planned, the timing, how she'd convinced him to dispose of Sylvia's body, how she'd impersonated her down to the scent she wore and the cadence of her voice. The entire machinery of the illusion was exposed. The confrontation was over. But for Miss Marple, the victory wasn't in the signatures or the case file. It was in the silence that followed. The first true stillness in the house since the wedding had begun. A stillness earned not through deception, but through truth, finally brought into the light. The estate had begun to breathe again. In the days following the full confessions, the hush that had blanketed Harwood slowly gave way to a strange sense of release. The staff moved without watching over their shoulders, the guests departed quietly, and the police presence thinned to routine checks and final statements. The worst was behind them, or so it seemed. Miss Marple stayed on a little longer at Daphne's request. The young woman had grown quiet but purposeful, a far cry from the bride-to-be who had floated through the early days of the wedding preparations. She spoke little of Oliver now, and when she did, it was with a clinical detachment, as though she was slowly extracting a splinter embedded too deep to be removed all at once. It was on the 5th morning, just after breakfast, when something shifted again. Creighton arrived earlier than expected, his expression grim, holding a folded paper and a photograph. He found Miss Marple in the drawing-room with her usual knitting on her lap, though the needles had been still for some time. "There's something we missed," he said without preamble. "Or rather, someone." Miss Marple looked up with mild surprise, but her voice remained calm. "Go on." Creighton placed the photograph on the side table. This was taken nearly 2 years ago, a security photo from a private estate in Kent. Ruth Hargreaves, under another alias, Martha Blythe. That, in itself, didn't surprise me, but look at who she's speaking with. Miss Marple leaned in and frowned. The image was grainy, but the profile beside Ruth's was unmistakable. Sharp nose, dark eyes, and a jawline that hadn't been seen at Harwood since the early days of the wedding preparations. She touched the edge of the photo. "Emily Fane." Creighton nodded. "We thought she was Ruth's temporary disguise, but that was never the case. Ruth and Emily were 2 different women. Ruth simply borrowed her identity after she left." Miss Marple sat back. Her voice was soft. "So where did the real Emily Fane go?" "We don't know. She hasn't been seen since the day she arrived at Harwood, 3 days before the wedding. No departure recorded. Her belongings were found at the inn but untouched. And the signature in the guest book." Creighton pulled out the second paper. "Not hers. It matches Ruth's hand exactly." A silence fell between them. Miss Marple's mind traced the old paths again. If Emily had arrived before the events began, and Ruth had posed as her afterward, then something else had occurred, something carefully hidden, carefully replaced. She stood abruptly. "We need to check the chapel, now." Creighton followed without hesitation, though his confusion grew with every step. The small Harwood chapel had not been visited since the night of Sylvia's death. It stood on the far end of the property, dust settling on the pews and altar undisturbed. Inside, Miss Marple moved quickly to the wooden panel beneath the organ loft. She'd noticed it once before during a walk with Daphne, a loose section, likely meant for repairs. She pried it open, reached inside, and drew out a cloth bundle. Creighton stared. "How did you—" She needed somewhere to hide the real body before she staged the switch. Sylvia's corpse was placed near the woods days later, but not immediately. That was a performance for our benefit. Miss Marple unfolded the cloth. Inside lay a coat, stained, torn. Monogram just inside the collar, E. Fane. Creighton's face hardened. She was killed too. Miss Marple nodded slowly. To remove the risk of exposure, Ruth met her ahead of time, perhaps under false pretenses. Emily was quiet, unassuming, an ideal choice. Ruth took her place, discarded the real woman somewhere remote on the grounds, and began to weave herself into the narrative, knowing we'd never suspect what we couldn't confirm. Creighton looked back toward the front of the chapel. So, we didn't catch the whole truth after all. No, Miss Marple said, we caught the criminal, but not the crime, not fully. They returned to the station in silence, the cloth bundle now sealed into evidence. Ruth, when confronted with it, said nothing. She merely smiled faintly, as if a puzzle had been solved in precisely the way she'd imagined. But Oliver, his reaction was different. When he saw the coat, his face crumpled. I told her not to. I told her she didn't have to do it again. Miss Marple stepped forward. You knew. I suspected, he whispered. I saw her once, with a suitcase. She said Emily had left early. I thought, I didn't want to know. That's what she counted on. Miss Marple let the silence linger. Then she spoke softly. She didn't just want to rewrite her life. She wanted to erase others completely, take their places, their stories. That was the real motive. Not power, not even control. She wanted to become the only voice left in the room. Creighton turned away, eyes cold. And now she has nothing left to say. The charges were amended, the reports rewritten. A second grave was found behind the chapel 2 days later, shallow, hastily covered. The remains confirmed through dental records. Emily Fane had never left Harwood alive. The press would later call it a case of dual identities and impersonation. They would write of psychological manipulation, of the deadly elegance of Ruth Hargreaves, but none of them would fully grasp what Miss Marple understood, that the crime had never been about deception for gain. It had been about annihilation through imitation. A woman who believed the only way to exist was to consume others until she wore their lives like costumes. On her final walk through the estate, Miss Marple stopped once more near the family chapel. The wind stirred gently through the trees, as if brushing dust from old secrets. She did not look back as she left. There was nothing more to uncover, only echoes now, and the quiet, solemn weight of truth finally laid bare. The last of the police. Vans pulled away from Harwood Estate just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the manicured grounds. The immediate tension of the past few days seemed to lift with their departure. But Miss Marple knew better than to believe that all had been resolved. Even after all the confessions, the evidence, and the arrests, there was still something lingering, in the air, something unfinished. It wasn't just about the crimes themselves. It was about the ripple effect, the lives altered forever by a web of deception that had been spun with such care that only the most vigilant would see its threads. Creighton was quiet too, his eyes often distant as he sat beside her in the study, both of them watching the estate slowly return to a hollow semblance of peace. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and yet the room felt cold. It's over then, Creighton said, though his voice held no certainty. Miss Marple looked at him with the faintest of smiles. No, Inspector, it's never over. Not really. The investigation had culminated in Ruth and Oliver's confessions. They had been taken to trial, and justice seemed to have been served. Yet something in the back of Miss Marple's mind refused to let her rest. The case, it seemed, had ended too neatly. The pieces all fit together, the motives exposed, the perpetrators caught. But the ease with which it had unfolded unsettled her. She knew the danger of assuming things were done simply because they had been tied up in neat packages. "Tell me," she said, after a long pause, her voice low, "do you recall anything unusual about the house's history? Something forgotten?" Creighton blinked, then frowned. "I'm not sure I follow." Miss Marple rose slowly, walking toward the window and glancing out at the fading light. "When I first arrived at Harwood, I assumed the people here had lived a life of refinement, dignity. But there's always more than that, isn't there? Everyone has something in their past, something buried. Ruth was running from something, we know that now. But there's something about the Harwoods themselves, their lineage. I've been thinking about it, about how Ruth was obsessed with Erasure." Creighton shifted, clearly intrigued. "You think there's more to it?" "I think," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that Ruth didn't come to Harwood just to hide. She came to replace someone. Not just Sylvia, someone older. Perhaps even Daphne." "Daphne?" Creighton repeated, brow furrowing. "Yes. Have you noticed how much she seems to have inherited from the older generations of Harwoods? Her manner, her restraint, a sort of practiced composure. It's not natural, not entirely. It's as if she's learned to suppress everything. And when she spoke to me about the ring, about it being lost and then found, I realized something. Daphne's story doesn't add up." Miss Marple paused by the hearth, her fingers grazing the carved mantel. "You see, Daphne was never meant to be the final heir. Not really. Ruth wasn't protecting her own life. She was protecting something else, the Harwood legacy." Creighton stared at her, his mind racing. "You mean—" "I mean that Ruth and Oliver's original plan wasn't just to silence Sylvia. It was to make sure no one would challenge what they'd built. They were going to replace Daphne too. She never would have known, you see. She was meant to marry Oliver, but the power wouldn't have been hers. It would have been Ruth's. The house, the name, the wealth, all of it would have shifted into her hands through Oliver, and then, with the ring as a symbol, Ruth would have become the rightful heir of the Harwood estate." Creighton was still processing the layers of Miss Marple's reasoning when she added, "It's the oldest trick, really. It's not enough to destroy one person. You need to destroy the line itself, erase it, take its place." "But why now?" Creighton asked. "Why this sudden move to replace Daphne?" Miss Marple looked at him, her gaze sharp. "Because Ruth knew that Oliver's marriage to Daphne was nearing its completion, and she knew that the inheritance would eventually be passed on. She couldn't afford to wait any longer." The pieces, once scattered across the floor like broken shards of glass, now began to take shape in Miss Marple's mind. Ruth had not just wanted to escape her past. She had been waiting for the right moment to make her own claim on Harwood, and Sylvia had unknowingly threatened that. But it wasn't just about one woman. Ruth was driven by something darker. She was obsessed with the idea of becoming more than a ghost from the past. She wanted to be the one who would define Harwood's future, and no one would take that from her. "The thing I didn't see earlier," Miss Marple said softly, "was how far Ruth was willing to go to make sure her plan succeeded. She wasn't just acting out of desperation or a desire for control. She was acting out of an almost pathological need to rewrite her place in the world, to erase every part of herself that had been overlooked, dismissed, or replaced by others. Creighton stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room. So what happens now? Ruth's confessed, but there's still something gnawing at me. We don't know the full extent of her plan. We still don't have all the answers. No, Miss Marple said quietly, her gaze far away as she stared out at the now darkened grounds. The confession is only the surface. The truth runs deeper than that. But it's not about solving the case anymore. It's about understanding how a person like Ruth could justify everything she did, how her mind worked in such a way that she believed there was no other choice. As Creighton walked toward the door, he glanced back. What do you mean? You think she's hiding something else? I think she's not finished yet, Miss Marple replied. And she never will be, as long as she believes the only way to exist is by becoming someone else entirely. When Creighton left, Miss Marple remained where she was by the window, her knitting needles in her hands, but still. The pieces had fallen into place, and yet the feeling lingered that something crucial had slipped through her fingers. A short time later, as Creighton made his final rounds with his officers, Miss Marple had the peculiar sense that the tension in the house hadn't dissipated as it should. In fact, it had only grown. She wasn't wrong. An hour before midnight, just as the final papers were being signed and the case closed, a light flickered in the east wing of Harwood. The guards outside stood alert, watching the shadows creep, but they saw nothing unusual. Until, moments later, a figure moved from the woods toward the side door. It was Ruth, alone. She slipped past unnoticed, moving with the same precision, the same careful control she had always possessed. She had broken free, and just as Miss Marple had predicted, the final twist had come. Long after everyone thought they had solved the case, Ruth wasn't finished, and now it was up to Miss Marple to stop her before she could rewrite the last chapter of the Harwood legacy once again. The moon hung high above Harwood Estate, casting long shadows across the sun-manicured lawns now still and quiet. The events of the past week had moved with such swift finality that even the air around the estate felt calmer, as though the house itself could finally exhale. Creighton and his officers were already packing up their things, preparing for the journey back to town, and the case was officially closed. Ruth had been found and detained, her actions fully revealed for all to see. Oliver, though still shaken, had been cleared of complicity, but his life would never return to what it had been. Daphne, though now free from the manipulations of the woman who had ensnared her family, was left with the bitter remnants of betrayal, her future uncertain. Miss Marple stood by the window of her room, her gaze lost in the silent world outside. The estate was emptying, but she still felt the weight of something pressing just beyond her reach, a lingering presence that refused to dissipate fully. The puzzle had been solved, the culprits caught, and yet she knew better than to believe that everything had truly been accounted for. She ran her fingers along the edge of her knitting basket, her mind wandering back to a small detail she'd almost overlooked during the chaos. Something Ruth had said, perhaps in passing, but something that hadn't quite settled with Miss Marple. It wasn't a clue, strictly speaking. It was a slip, an inconsistency in Ruth's carefully constructed narrative. Ruth had spoken of the letter, the one Sylvia had hidden. She had confessed that she'd been looking for it, had tried to destroy it once she realized it was the final piece of Sylvia's suspicions, but she had also said something that didn't make sense. When questioned about Sylvia's behavior the night before her death, Ruth had mentioned that Sylvia had finally understood. But understood what? She'd been so certain, so sure of her control, that Miss Marple wondered if Ruth had given herself away in that moment. There had been something else, something Ruth hadn't realized she'd let slip, something important. And then there was the letter itself. Ruth had been relentless in her pursuit of it. She had made sure it never reached the authorities, but Miss Marple realized that it hadn't been about just hiding evidence. Ruth wasn't just trying to erase Sylvia's warnings. She was trying to remove something else entirely, the last thread of a family story that had no place in her future plans, something that could unravel everything. Miss Marple took a deep breath and turned from the window. Her steps measured as she walked toward the door. The house seemed quieter now, almost empty. Yet there was still something lingering, just beyond the edges of the case, just beyond the finality of confession. She stepped into the hallway, walking slowly down the corridor toward the study. She had no intention of leaving Harwood just yet. There was still something she needed to do. Something Ruth had overlooked in her haste to claim victory. Something that Miss Marple had seen but not fully understood until now. Inside the study, the desk was bare, save for a few papers that had been left for Creighton's report. But the top drawer, the one she had briefly opened when she first arrived, still had something inside it. A photograph, carefully folded beneath a stack of old letters. She slid it free, unfolding it with care. It was a picture of the Harwood family, taken many years ago. In it, Sylvia was standing beside a younger Oliver and a much younger Daphne, but it wasn't the people who caught Miss Marple's attention. It was the background. The old library behind them with its towering shelves, the staircase in the distance and almost hidden in the corner. Another figure, almost out of focus. The woman was standing just behind Oliver, almost blending into the shadows. She was older than the others in the photograph, and her expression was hard to read. But Miss Marple recognized the features, sharp eyes, a tight jaw, and a posture that was both calculated and unyielding. Ruth. Miss Marple had seen it before, but now in this context it made sense. Ruth had been here long before the events of the past few weeks. She had been a part of the family history, a part of their past. Ruth was not just an outsider, someone who had infiltrated the family from the outside. She was someone with a deep and tangled connection to the very roots of Harwood Estate. Miss Marple turned the photograph over, finding the faint, faded inscription on the back. R. Hargreaves, daughter of the estate manager, year 1925. Ruth had been here before, long before she'd donned her new identities, before she'd manipulated Oliver into her grasp. She had been a part of Harwood Estate's history, a ghost from the past that no one had ever truly seen. And now, Miss Marple realized, Ruth had returned to claim what she had always thought should be hers, the estate, the inheritance, the name itself, all of it. Ruth had played a long game, weaving her way back into the story she'd been a part of before. And in her blind ambition, Ruth had nearly erased a legacy, one that had been just as much a part of her as it was a part of Daphne or Sylvia. Miss Marple tucked the photograph back into the drawer, her mind made up. She knew how to end this now, not with a confession, not with a trial, but with a truth that had always been there, quietly sitting in the shadows. The story of Ruth Hargreaves was not just about theft or murder or manipulation. It was about a woman who could not bear to be forgotten. A woman whose desire to rewrite her place in history had led her to commit the ultimate crime, the erasure of everyone who had come before her. As Miss Marple closed the drawer and turned back toward the door, she felt the quiet weight of the moment settle over her. The case was closed in the traditional sense. Ruth and Oliver had been caught, the confessions filed away, the truth set free. But the real story, the real reason behind the crime, was not something that could be tied up neatly or explained in the reports. Some mysteries, Miss Marple knew, could never truly be finished. They lived on in the spaces between the lines, in the whispers that followed long after the last word was spoken. And as she walked toward the stairs, her mind already on the next case, Miss Marple knew that there would always be another story to uncover, another mystery hidden just beneath the surface. Because the truth, as always, was a shifting, elusive thing, one that never truly ended. It simply waited, quietly, for the next person to see it.